Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Across State Lines. I'm your host, Danielle. I hope that everybody had a great holiday season and a happy new year. And thank you so much for tuning back into the podcast for episode 22, where today we will be discussing the case of Summit Meadow Jane Doe, who is now known as Patricia Hicks Dahlstrom. This is going to be a slightly longer episode than usual, as there's so much information about this case, which dives into two known serial killers, a cult, and the life of our victim. So grab a snack and a drink if you can, settle in, and enjoy the episode. In 1983, a family who was visiting Yosemite National Park in California stumbled upon partial human remains that had belonged to a woman in her 20s, and her identity had eluded police for 40 years. During the course of the investigation, a well-known serial killer had come to light, and when investigated, he claimed that he had killed Jane Doe. However, this particular serial killer had falsely confessed to hundreds of murders, and his tales were largely discredited by both investigators and the public alike. Another serial killer began to kill in Yosemite National Park a decade later, and this killer had even had contact with Jane Doe a decade prior, so he was considered a suspect as well. In 2022, Jane Doe's identity was uncovered when DNA and genetic genealogy identified her as Patricia Hicks Dahlstrom, and a dive into her life story took investigators into the world of a very ominous cult. Still, today, her case is unsolved, though investigators have a decent idea of who may have killed her based on some of the items found at the scene. But before we dive into the case, I just want to remind everybody that Across State Lines is available on all podcast streaming platforms, such as Spotify, YouTube, Apple Music, and anywhere else that you might listen. If you are liking Across State Lines and would like to leave us a rating, a review, or a follow, it would be greatly appreciated. If you want to leave us any feedback, go to our website and send us an email. Thank you so much for listening, and now, let's dive into the case of Summit Meadow Jane Doe, now known as Patricia Hicks Dahlstrom. In the summer of 1983, a family was visiting the Yosemite National Park in California, eager to spend the day taking in the sights of the lush green forest and stunning mountain peaks. However, the day had something far more somber in store for them, something that would remain a mystery for over 40 years. The family, which comprised of adults and a few children, pulled over on the side of a forest road next to Summit Meadow, and most of the children dispersed in different directions once they exited the car, excited to get out and play. A young teenage boy in the group hung back with his father, and the two strolled over to the tree line where the forest met the meadow grass. With very little to do in ways of entertaining himself, as he was speaking with his father, the boy picked up a stick and began to idly dig into the dirt with it. As the boy moved the stick back and forth in the dirt, he noticed he was uncovering something underneath, which looked off-white in color. The father and son looked closer, and as the father knelt down to inspect what it was, he noticed fingers were sticking out from underneath the dirt. He immediately told his son to head back to the car, gathered all the children, and the family made their way to the Forest Service Rangers building to report the remains that they had found. When investigators arrived on scene, they discovered that the remains consisted of a severed arm and hand, which had been mostly decomposed, yet still had pieces of flesh attached to the bones. Investigators believe that animals must have scattered the rest of the remains, and that the body had most likely been lying out in Summit Meadow since sometime in 1982. They concluded that the body had been previously frozen due to icy temperatures of the following winter, and then had thawed out during the spring and once again began to decompose during the hot summer months. A medical examiner examined the forearm and the hand and was able to determine that the remains most likely belonged to a petite woman at least 25 years of age, who most likely weighed around 110 pounds. A large-scale search was put on for the rest of the remains, which included helicopters and volunteer searchers on foot, yet nothing else was discovered. 2 National Park criminal investigators were tasked with the case of Summit Meadow Jane Doe, Don Coho and Kimberly Tucker. They began their search for the woman's identity by combing through missing persons reports from Yosemite National Park within the last few years, and stumbled upon a case that may have fit. 14-year-old Stacey Harris, who went missing in the park in 1981. Stacey and her father ventured into Yosemite to embark on a 4-day trip of the High Sierra Loop, which was to be done riding mule with a group of 8 other people. The first leg of the trip was to ride the mules to Sunset High Sierra Camp, which was at an elevation of 9,400 feet above sea level. The group arrived to the camp around 3 p.m. on the 17th, and once they settled in, Stacey took a shower and decided that she wanted to walk 1.5 miles to the nearby Sunset Lake. Another man, who was much older at 77 years old, agreed to walk with her to the lake. However, he quickly tired and needed to take a break during the hike and sit down. Stacey continued on without him, and she was last seen by the tour guide, who stated that he saw her about 50 yards south of the trail. Stacey was never seen again. While Stacey Harris seemed like a viable candidate to be Jane Doe, she was soon ruled out, and investigators were back to square one. With very little to work with, they seemed to be at a loss. However, in 1984, word began to spread that a serial killer had just been arrested in Texas, and he had been confessing to have killed upwards of 150 people all across America, including California. The man was named Henry Lee Lucas, a name many of us are already very familiar with. Henry Lee Lucas was born on August 23, 1936, in a log cabin in Blacksburg, Virginia, to parents Nellie Viola Lucas and Anderson Lucas. Henry's father would lose both of his legs in a freight train accident, and kids in the neighborhood would taunt him and call him No Legs. Henry's upbringing was tumultuous, and when he was 8 years old, his mother beat him so viciously over the head with a wooden plank, it caused him to spend 3 days in a coma. When Henry was 10, one of his brothers stabbed him in the eye with a knife, which quickly became infected when his mother sought him no medical care. His mother ignored Henry's injuries for days, until a teacher smacked him in the face with a steel ruler, which caused the eye to burst. After this, the eyeball was surgically removed, and he was fit with a glass prosthetic eye. The abuse in Henry's childhood went further than physical abuse into mental and emotional torture. His mother, who was a sex worker, would force Henry to sit and watch her have sex with clients, and if he didn't watch, she would beat him until he turned around. In time, Henry's mother would begin to dress him in women's clothing and pimp him out to clients as well, both men and women. His mother also shot and killed Henry's pet mule in his 20s. This cumulative abuse is what Henry said caused him to despise women as a whole, saying he wanted to kill every woman in the world, and he didn't even think of them as human. In December of 1959, Nellie would visit Henry in Michigan for Christmas, and while she was there, she repeatedly told Henry how much she disapproved of his fiancée, Stella Curtis. Nellie insisted that Henry move back to Virginia to care for her as she was elderly, and this led to many arguments between mother and son. On January 11, 1960, the arguments escalated to the point that Nellie picked up a broom and hit Henry over the head, and he retaliated by picking up a knife and stabbing her in the neck, killing her. Henry was arrested after he attempted to flee, and he was sentenced to 40 years in prison. But after a handful of suicide attempts, he was transferred to the Ionia State Mental Hospital. Henry was released in 1970 due to overcrowding, and he told the psychiatrist who evaluated him that he was not ready to go, and that they would regret it if they let him leave early. They released him anyway. Henry has claimed to have committed many, many murders over the years, some alone and some with his partner, Otis O'Toole. Henry once said, quote, "I killed him every which way there is except poison. There's been strangulations, there's been knifings, there's been shootings, there's been hit and runs. I didn't have any emotion. I had no feeling for the people themselves or any of my crimes. I'd pick them up hitchhiking, running and playing, stuff like that. We'd get to going and having a good time. First thing you know, I'd kill her and I'd throw her out somewhere. I don't know how to really explain why I kept on. It was just, like I say, as though I left my body. And just as though the more you look at them, as though that person wasn't dead, and you just keep stabbing them and imagining that the person's not dying. End quote. Despite being released, Henry was finally caught again when his murders began to get a little too close to home. Henry began to hang out with a 15-year-old girl, Becky Powell, and the two made their way to California, where Henry's employer's wife had asked Becky and Henry to care for her invalid mother, Kate Ridge. Kate went missing 3 weeks later, and soon, Becky would wind up missing as well. Police connected the dots back to Henry Lee Lucas and arrested him, to which he quickly confessed to both murders. Henry claimed that he had stabbed Kate to death and burned her body in a gas-operated oven, and that he had gotten into an argument with Becky, and he had stabbed her in the chest with a knife. He stated that he then proceeded to engage in necrophilia with Becky's body before he dismembered her and buried her in a field next to a train station. He wound up bringing the police to Becky's remains, and they were able to locate all of her. Once Henry was in jail, he began to confess to many, many more murders. Not dozens, but hundreds. It got to the point that Henry was taking tours all across the country, with investigators letting Henry lead the way to crime scenes he claimed to have been involved with, and this led to many crimes being closed. When detectives on the Summit Meadow case heard of this and learned that Henry had killed in national parks across the country, they too were eager to speak with him. They scheduled a meeting, and Henry was brought to both Don and Kimberly, and an interview was conducted. Henry, naturally, confessed to the crime, stating that he had strangled a woman and left her body in Yosemite, but that was about as much as he gave them. It got to a point where a journalist began to notice some gaps, or rather, glaringly obvious oversights in Henry's stories. He would claim to have committed a murder in one state, and then the very next day had committed another murder clear across the country. It became obvious to investigators across the nation and the public that Henry Lee Lucas was more of a hoax than anything, and his stories were now looked upon with skepticism instead of intrigue. Technically, he was a serial killer, but everyone began to think that his killings were far less than what he had claimed to have actually committed. However, Kimberly and Don still felt the need to speak to Henry one more time, but they went into this meeting with a skeptical mindset. The two investigators flew to Texas to interview Henry in the prison that he was at, and when they arrived, the Texas Ranger asked them if they were armed. The pair stated that they were not armed because in that time period, no one was permitted to fly with guns, and the Texas Ranger told them that if they wanted to interview Henry Lee Lucas, they needed to be armed, and he handed them his own gun. Don and Kimberly entered the meeting with Henry, and it began the same as before. Small details that seemed vague, very little information, but enough to keep them on the hook, until Henry said something curious. He stated that when he picked up a blonde hitchhiker, he took her to a clearing where they had sex, and he told her it was time to go. This woman said that she wanted to stay a bit longer, and he said, "Okay, then I'll leave you here," and he proceeded to strangle her to death. He stated that after killing her, he looked up into the trees and noticed some yellow wooden signs nailed into the trees above him, about 20 feet up, that had numbers etched into them. This instantly got Don's attention because he knew that Summit Meadow had skier signs nailed into the trees, which would help direct skiers on which trails they were to proceed on. These signs were not everywhere in the park, but they were in Summit Meadow. Don and Kimberly asked Henry for more details about the days spent in Yosemite with the hitchhiker, and he stated that the two sat down in an area under some trees, had about 4 cans of Budweiser beer, some fried chicken that had been wrapped in tinfoil, and had consensual sex. He told the detectives that if they found the spot, they would find tinfoil, beer cans, a canteen, and a piece of fabric from the hitchhiker's jacket. Don and Kimberly thanked Henry Lee Lucas for the interview and left back home to Yosemite, eager to try to locate the exact spot that Henry might have been that day. Dawn and Kimberly arrived back into California and made their way to the spot that Summit Meadow Jane Doe's remains were found and began to search around, not expecting to find much. However, 40 yards away from where the arm and hand were found, one of the investigators spotted something on the ground. It was 4 empty Budweiser cans. Knowing Budweiser was a popular beer and it wasn't uncommon for trash to be left around the park, they considered it intriguing, but not quite the score they were looking for. But it was enough for them to continue searching in hopes for more. On the same day of the search, they were able to locate 3 more items: a crumpled up piece of tinfoil with fried chicken remnants inside, a canteen, and a piece of green fabric which seemed to belong to an item of clothing, exactly as Henry Lee Lucas said. This was enough for the 2 investigators to believe that Henry was most likely responsible for the death of Summit Meadow Jane Doe. However, a few days after their discovery, Kimberly Tucker was taken off the case and reassigned to manager of concessions in the park. Her superiors mentioned that this was because they hadn't needed so many park criminal investigators, but it was a huge blow not only to Kimberly, but to Dawn in the case of Summit Meadow Jane Doe as well. Unfortunately, this led to the case being put on the back burner for many years, until a skull was found nearby Summit Meadow and was conclusively linked to belonging to the same person that the arm belonged to. With the skull, investigators were able to put together a composite sketch of Jane Doe, using her skull and clay to form her features. Testing revealed that Jane Doe might have been of Latin descent, and her composite bust and sketch were made with dark hair and dark features. However, this led to very little in terms of leads. Once again, the case went on the back burner until more killings began within Yosemite National Park in the 1990s. On March 18, 1999, 42-year-old Carol Yvonne Sund, her 15-year-old daughter Juliana Sund, and 16-year-old Argentinian foreign exchange student Silvina Peloso were staying at Cedar Lodge just outside of Yosemite National Park when the 3 women suddenly went missing. A large-scale search was put on for the 3 missing women, and eventually the charred bodies of Carol and Silvina were found in the trunk of their rented Pontiac car. Carol had been strangled and shot to death, and Silvina had been raped and shot. Since they were both burned beyond recognition, dental records had been used to confirm their identities. A week went by with no sign of where Juliana had been, when a hand-drawn map was sent into the local police with directions to where Juliana's body could be found. On top of the map, the words, "We had fun with this one," were scrawled in ink. Investigators went to the area marked on the map, where they discovered the remains of Juliana, who had been raped and her throat slit. During their investigation, they began to interview the staff of Cedar Lodge, where the women had been staying, for any information about who may have killed them or if anyone suspicious had been on the grounds of the property leading up to their murders. Numerous employees were interviewed, including a man named Cary Stainer, who had stayed calm during his interview and was not considered a suspect due to the fact that he had no prior criminal record and was seemingly not suspicious during his interviews with police. A few months later, on July 22, 1999, 26-year-old Joie Ruth Armstrong was taking a hike within Yosemite National Park. Joie had passed numerous other hikers and had waved to a few before continuing on her walk, but a few minutes after she waved to a couple whom she passed, the sounds of blood-curdling screams rang out in the forest. A handful of hikers rushed into the direction of the screams, where they found Joie covered in blood. Joie had been stabbed and was bleeding to death, but sadly, despite being found so soon, she succumbed to her injuries and was pronounced dead. When police began to interview witnesses nearby the trails, and also witnesses where she was staying, police learned of a blue 1972 International Scout that had been parked outside her cabin the day prior. This vehicle was learned to be owned by Cary Stainer, who quickly became the prime suspect not only in Joie's murder, but the murders of the 3 women several months prior. When this information was discovered, police quickly tracked down Stainer in a nudist resort in Wilton, California, and he was promptly arrested and taken into a Sacramento police station for questioning. When interviewed, Stainer quickly confessed to the murder of Joao Armstrong and the murders of Carol Sund, Juliana Sund, and Silvina Palesso. The name Cary Stainer was not unknown to the police nor the public, as his family had been in the news prior due to his own brother's kidnapping, which lasted 7 years before he escaped. Stephen Stainer, brother of Cary Stainer, was abducted from Merced, California on December 4, 1972, when he was approached on his walk home from school by a man named Irvin Edward Murphy. Irvin was acquaintances with a convicted child sex offender by the name of Kenneth Parnell. Irvin was described as simple and trusting, and Parnell had told Irvin that he was a pastor and he needed help abducting young boys so he could raise them religious and following the Lord. Irvin used religious tracts to stop and talk to boys, mostly telling them that their church needed donations. On December 4th, he spotted Stephen and asked him if his mother would be willing to donate to the church, and Stephen said yes, that she most likely would. Irvin then told Stephen to hop in his car and he would drive him back home so they could speak to his mother. And a white van pulled up that had Parnell sitting at the wheel, and Stephen hopped in. However, Parnell and Irvin did not take Stephen home, but instead to a cabin in Cathy's Valley, which was sadly only several hundred yards away from Stephen's own grandfather's home. Stephen was repeatedly raped by Parnell, and when he asked if he could go home, Parnell told him that his parents signed over legal custody to him as they could not afford so many children, so Stephen belonged to him now. Stephen was given a new name, Dennis Gregory Parnell, and Parnell passed himself off as Stephen's father, and the two traveled across California, frequently moving. When Stephen became a teenager, he was often left unguarded by Parnell, and even allowed to go out on his own. But later, when asked why he hadn't tried to escape during those moments, Stephen sadly stated that he had no idea how to summon for help. As Stephen got older, Parnell began to look for a younger boy to kidnap, using Stephen as a way to lure in younger children. Most attempts were unsuccessful. However, on February 14, 1980, Parnell kidnapped 5-year-old Timothy White. Seeing another boy having to endure what Stephen himself had gone through, Stephen was determined to return Timothy to his parents. On March 1, 1980, while Parnell was working, Stephen and Timothy left Parnell's home and hitchhiked to Timothy's hometown. But unfortunately, young Timothy wasn't able to direct Stephen to the home of his mother and father. Instead, they went to the police station and explained their story, and Parnell was quickly arrested and taken into custody. Stephen and Timothy were both returned to their families, and Parnell was convicted of kidnapping and sentenced to 7 years in prison, but only served 5 before he was released on parole. Stephen, back at home with his parents and siblings, had no idea that his own brother was in the making of becoming a serial killer in the same area he was abducted from. Once Cary Stainer was arrested for the Yosemite murders, police began to theorize if he was responsible for the Summit Meadow Jane Doe murder, as they believed his killing started long before 1999. Cary would have been about 22 to 23 when the killing of Summit Meadow Jane Doe happened, and he resided in nearby Merced, merely 75 miles from Yosemite, on top of being known to spend a lot of time within the park during his life. However, without an identity to Jane Doe, it was nearly impossible to link him to her killing. Years continued to go by after Cary Stainer was arrested, and by 2017, the case of Summit Meadow Jane Doe was more or less forgotten about, except by those who had taken the case to heart, notably Don and Kimberly, who had first worked the case back in the 1980s. By now, Kimberly's children were grown, and her son Cullen was also working in the Yosemite National Park and soon took on the role of criminal investigator. Cullen and his boss were in their office one day, and his boss pulled out an old, dusty box marked Summit Meadow and had explained to him that his mother had once worked on this case and asked him if he was interested in picking it back up and seeing if he could find any new leads. Cullen happily agreed and set to work on the case of Summit Meadow Jane Doe. The skull was sent to the National Center of Missing and Exploited Children, where a CT scan was done on it and a new composite sketch was made up of Summit Meadow Jane Doe. A sample was also sent to Parabon Labs to determine a DNA profile, which was successful in pulling a full DNA profile from the remains. Based on the DNA testing and the CT scan, Cullen was shocked when the image of the composite sketch came back to him through email. The woman found in the Meadow in the 80s wasn't of Latin descent, nor did she have dark features. The sketch was of a fair-haired, blue-eyed woman with blonde hair. While they still had nowhere to turn using this information alone, it was a shock to investigators and Cullen's mother, Kimberly, to have a face to match the remains, let alone one that looked drastically different from what they had thought she looked like. When genetic genealogy began to break through as a forerunner in helping solve cases, such as in the case of Joseph James D'Angelo as the Golden State Killer, investigators on the Summit Meadow case were eager to see if they could use genetic genealogy to solve the identity of their Jane Doe. With the DNA at Parabon, they put a genealogist on the case who was able to determine a family tree for Jane Doe that went back as far as the 1600s. Soon, they were able to narrow it down to one single woman who disappeared from record around 1982. Her name was Patricia Hicks Dahlstrom. Cullen Tucker was able to determine that Patricia still had a living sibling, as well as a handful of nieces and nephews, and he began to call the family in hopes of speaking to them about Patricia. He called numerous times in one day with no answer, until finally, a woman picked up on the other end, and Cullen stated that he had worked for the Yosemite National Park Criminal Division, and that he wanted to speak to her about Patricia Hicks. The woman on the other end of the line was shocked and stated that Patricia was her aunt and that she had been missing for over 40 years after she had left town with a cult. Cullen had to deliver the bad news that her aunt was not only deceased, but that she had been a Jane Doe for decades and had most likely died at the hands of a serial killer. What Cullen would uncover about Patricia and her whereabouts before her murder proved to be almost as dark as her death itself. Patricia Maria Hicks Dahlstrom was born on June 1, 1954, in Spokane, Washington, to parents Otilla Schoenwald and Edwin Gilbert Hicks. She had two older siblings, Judith and Edwin Jr., and she was especially close with her older brother. Patricia was described as happy and bubbly, and her best friend stated that she was drawn to her in the 8th grade because she was loud and boisterous, and because she cussed. When Patricia was 17 and a junior in high school, the United States Army had sent her family a letter regarding her older brother Edwin, who was enlisted. The letter stated that Edwin had committed suicide and had shot himself. When Patricia learned of this, her best friend stated that she had drastically changed, and instead of being the bubbly, boisterous girl she had grown to love, she became withdrawn and in her own head much of the time. Her best friend stated that she no longer had a zest for life like she had once had. While Patricia was already into spiritual books prior to her brother's death, it was said afterwards she fully immersed herself in them, perhaps in an attempt to find answers that she was longing for. Once Patricia graduated from high school in 1972, she said goodbye to her best friend who was taking a summer trip, and the two didn't see each other until the following year. When the two friends parted, Patricia was already seeing a fellow student by the name of Ed Dahlstrom, and by the time her friend returned back to Spokane, Patricia had married him. The marriage didn't last long, however, and Patricia had filed for divorce in 1974, keeping her ex-husband's last name of Dahlstrom. By the time that Patricia was 25, her spiritual journey had led her to the path of a local cult, which she had deeply immersed herself in. When Patricia's best friend last saw her, she stated that she had gone to Patricia's home, which was a single room, and on the ground laid a single mat and an altar in the corner, and that Patricia had shaved her head because the cult leader told her that she was too vain about her hair. Soon after this, Patricia moved to Merced, California with the cults, and family was not able to contact her again. In 1982, Patricia's mother had died, and even then Patricia's sister wasn't able to find her in order to let her know. The leader of the cult was Donald Gibson, who had quite a tumultuous upbringing. While 3 of Donald's siblings turned to heroin to cope for their upbringing, Donald had turned to Eastern religion. Donald's niece stated that Donald had a very charismatic, magnetic personality, and that he had had a talent for zeroing in on what someone might need or was lacking in their lives. This led Donald to gaining the trust of those around him, which he then used to form the cult that he ran. While many people who had been a part of the cult in the 1980s refused to speak to investigators, still out of fear of Donald, a prior roommate did offer to speak to them and stated in a text to Cullen Tucker, quote, "I was emotionally ragged and raw. It had taken me many, many years to heal and gain insight into those years. I had to throw out most of what I believed and accepted to be true about myself, God, and my personal salvation. Finding some peace of heart and peace of mind has been a long, hard struggle. Donald brought Patty to Merced from Spokane, and I believe I met her in 1978. Donald asked me if I would take her in. I loved her from the first time I met her. I was raising 2 boys alone and working, had no social life, and it was nice having another woman in the house. I feel Patty was my saving grace. Patty was a young woman looking for a purpose in her life. I never understood how Donald could attract intelligent, beautiful women to follow him. I never could figure that one out. But Donald attracted young males with sex and drugs. I remember a lot of attractive young men, all with a glazed expression." End quote. The cult took a very dark turn once it was fully formed, with Donald taking the members' paychecks, forcing them into arranged marriages, and requiring sexual rituals in front of the entire group. Donald would routinely go into parks in order to try to recruit new members, and a victim of Donald stated that he had met him in a park and felt that he was under some kind of trance after Donald had offered him some LSD. He stated that he quickly lost consciousness, and when he finally woke, that Donald was performing an oral sex act on him against his will. Donald explained to the underage teenager that he, quote, "needed his seed for religious purposes." According to police, this had happened numerous times over to different victims, and when this victim came forward, they'd put out an arrest warrant for Donald Gibson. Donald was arrested for supplying drugs to minors, as well as for sodomy and oral copulation of minors, and was sent to trial. A lead detective on the case against Donald stated to a documentary program, Wild Crime, quote, "Until Donald was arrested and charged, I had no idea of the sexual abuse that was occurring on those young cult members. I was stunned when the charges were first read. I think my jaw dropped. I was surprised about a lot of things that I wasn't aware of. It was a shock, I know, to all of us. At the start of the trial, I personally came to believe that Donald Gibson had some power. I can understand why a young man would sense power in Gibson as I felt it. During the trial, we really got to look at how this cult operated and the amount of power that Mr. Gibson had over his followers. Some people described him as a predator. Other people described him as manipulative, that he's a person that could take advantage of people, and other people didn't really see him as a threat. Most of the people in the cult remained obedient to Gibson. But points during the trial, he was very angry that their testimony was not stronger than it was. I think that Gibson was capable of killing someone that he had felt failed him, including Patty Dahlstrom. Donald Gibson was found guilty on 2 counts of oral copulation with minors and 2 counts of sodomy with minors, a total of 4 counts. After the jury found Gibson guilty, I requested that the court take him into custody, and that's what should have happened. But he was out of custody. I don't think Gibson was stupid. He was aware that he was going to go into custody. He figured it was time to vamoose. End quote. Strangely, when Patricia testified in defense of Donald Gibson, another name familiar to this case was in the courtroom as a spectator, Carrie Stainer. The Stainer family and the Gibson family were longtime close friends, and Carrie was a good friend of Donald's. Carrie was there when Patricia gave her testimony. However, it is still uncertain if Carrie had anything to do with her death. A detective on the case said this about Carrie being in the courtroom, quote, "The only thing that really surprised me was during Donald Gibson's trial, nobody knew until years later that Carrie Stainer was one of the spectators in that trial. This was in 1981. 17 years later, in 1999, Carrie Stainer killed 4 people in and around Yosemite National Park. The Stainer family and the Gibson family were friends. The Stainer family would watch the kids, the Gibson family, and vice versa. And even sometimes the Stainer grandparents would also watch the kids. If Carrie Stainer were in the courtroom when Patty was testifying, there could have been an innocent reason for it. He knew the Gibson family, and he wanted to show support. But here's what's important. That would have been the opportunity for him to come into contact with Patty, who ultimately goes on to become a homicide victim. And you know that Carrie Stainer went on to become a serial killer. That becomes an important piece of information that you have to resolve somehow. Knowing that Carrie Stainer was at Donald's trial makes me wonder, was there more of a connection than what we knew about? End quote. Donald Gibson never showed up for his sentencing date, and he has evaded police until this day. Once Donald was gone for about a month, Patricia decided that there was nothing left for her in California, and she boarded a bus to leave and never told her roommate where her final destination was going to be. All we know is that Patricia Hicks Dahlstrom somehow ended up in Summit Meadow of Yosemite National Park, where she would eventually wind up dead and her identity unknown for over 40 years. We know she crossed paths with a serial killer, Carrie Stainer, an insane cult leader, Donald Gibson, and perhaps the most intriguing of them all, Henry Lee Lucas. Lucas is known for mostly being a fraud, despite having a few confirmed deaths to his name, but authorities who have worked this case firmly believe that he must be the killer of Patricia Hicks Dahlstrom, based on the fact that the 4 items that he said would be in the vicinity of her body were in fact there. Patricia's case has never been solved, but the only silver lining of this case is that she was finally able to get her name back and her story told. Thank you so much for listening to Across State Lines, and we will be back next week to dive into another unsolved case. Please follow or subscribe to Across State Lines on your podcast listening platform, so that way new episodes will drop directly into your listening feed. If you'd like to rate or review Across State Lines on whatever platform you listen to, it would be greatly appreciated. Thank you so much, and join us again next week.